Berlin and Costa Rica. And
Nice. We spent about a year living close to Lake Arenal in La
okay,
Fortuna.
yeah. It's, but what made you move over to
To Costa Rica or to Colombia?
Colombia?
To Colombia, it was a blend of the experience we gained while we were in Costa Rica, of what we
Mm-hmm,
liked and what didn't work for us as a family.
mm-hmm,
We were staying at an eco hotel
mm-hmm,
permaculture project, a large one,
mm-hmm,
like almost 400 acres, so a really big piece of land. But because it's set up as a hotel,
mm-hmm,
that meant that it really wasn't a good place to have a child.
mm-hmm,
It
mm-hmm.
conflicted with the guest experience of hotel guests,
Oh.
some of whom like children and some don't.
Uh-huh,
And
uh-huh.
there weren't other children around. We were pretty remote and isolated where we were.
Mm,
So we learned a lot while we were there, but it wasn't a good fit for our family.
okay.
And coming to Colombia was uh, one of the attractors for us was that we met a family that's based here in Barichara, where
Mm-hmm,
we're living, that were both participating in a community reforestation project.
mm-hmm,
So not just like a separate permaculture camp off on the
mm-hmm.
side of the community, but a
But part.
Colombian-led
Mm,
community reforestation project.
nice.
And they were placing children at the center of their work because they have
Mm-hmm,
3 children of their own.
mm-hmm.
So we could bring our daughter in
Beautiful. Yeah,
and participate in that. And then
yeah.
we came here and fell in love and
And that's
are
such an
feeling very
essential
situated.
part, right? I mean, that's the next generation. That's what we're doing all this for.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the ideas we have is that children need to be the heart of regenerative work. So
Mm-hmm,
you always place them right in the middle of the activities
mm-hmm.
and then build the adult world around what the children need.
That's beautiful. But let's keep that
Yeah.
thought for later. Let
Yes.
me quickly give you a little bit of a framing. Um, how we're going to do this today. And so we usually do a first section where you get the chance to show yourself, right? I think this is important that whoever will listen to this um, can contextualize what comes after, right? So a little bit about your path, uh, what is important to you, etc. So get a feeling for you. What makes you happy? What hurts you? You know, things like that. Um, and take, I don't know, 15 minutes, whatever you need, roughly 15, I would guess, for that, until you feel complete. And then we go into the question. You can either do that by yourself, just slide into it,
Mhm.
just mark it, just say, okay, I'm going into this now, so people can change context, or I'll ask the question. And the question then is, um, and it's um, you can break it as soon as I've posed it, but I want to pose it anyway. So the question is in a way very abstract, but also practical. Imagine you're somewhere in the outback, right? Somewhere in the world. You can choose
Mhm.
where. You're building a community from scratch, right? What what is in general the things you think are important to take into account, but what would your specific role and contribution be, and what would you bring from the current mode of civilization with you? What would you avoid bringing, and how would you do this, right? So having said that, I think both you and I are aware that the model that you're doing, integrating into an existing community, is probably the superior model to just going somewhere, being the gringo that comes in with dollars and builds something nice. Um, but I'd like to keep it in the like the boundaries clear, as an empty space to play with. And then you can still say it doesn't make sense, right? It just doesn't make sense. Find people that are there already and integrate with them, something like this. That's totally fine. Um, so that's how we frame it. And to give you just so it's reciprocal. To give you a little bit of insight, who you're talking with, let me give you like a 3 minute overview, and then we can start with your introduction, if you like.
Wonderful.
Okay. So I've been brought up in a very academic environment. So our conversations around the dinner table were about, on the one hand, uh, civilization and ecosystems collapse. On the other hand, about the um, potential and power of science. So we're talking
Okay.
about ion channels and power microscopy and about nuclear war and all of these things. And that's really is my deep programming. And that gave me the task to do something. And for a long time, I was searching what to do. I stumbled upon the internet sometime in the 90s. I started coding. I started building stuff, but I was still lost for quite some time. And then the first handle I got on things was in a meeting in 2003 when I met the former um, uh, president or chairman of the Central Bank of Belgium, Bernard Lietaer, and Bernard had also architect was also one of the architects of the introduction of the euro, and he was in a meeting with Ernst Welteke, who was the head of the central bank in Germany at the time, and those guys were running a project where they wanted to introduce a new form of currency somewhere in Germany. And I was there because the company I had founded a year earlier was supposed to build a platform for that stuff. And that never happened, but I got to know the dynamics of fiat currency. Bernard was so nice to explain all of that to me, and I learned a lot from him. So that was the first like pivotal moment, that where I really understood the lock-ins of our systems and got a handle on them. And and then the next pivotal moment was 2009 when my son arrived, and I finally had to do something meaningful, not stop thinking and talking, start doing.
Yeah,
And
get dirt under your fingers. Like
correct. So not right now, but
yes.
uh, um, but in so I started a company that is the core. I call this the motor because it generates enough financial capital to run a machine, and a machine consists of three portions. One portion is what I call deep alignment, which is all about things that you do to center yourself, to ground yourself, to evolve. All of you know what I'm talking about. Then the second element is future
Yeah.
articulation. That's all about uh, going into horizon building together. Um, where do you want to go? Detach from your current modes of operation, etc. And I'm doing a little project with a fellow acquaintance, Jim Rutt, on this as well.
Oh yeah.
And there's a
Yeah,
there's a bu-
Jim.
there's a
Good
bunch of
friend.
books and other sorts of projects around that. And the third element is steering adaptation. And that's the actual doing of the stuff. So moving, taking action steps, moving towards the horizon. And the whole thing I call full circle because you go in circles, right? And you have to check back in with yourself. You have to adjust your horizon. Then you have to adjust your doing all the time. Part of the steering adaptation is what we do with Pirate Academy, and our tension with the Pirate Academy is to slowly build first a faculty and the knowledge base
Mhm.
to enable people and to scale this enablement of people to build self-sustaining, self-sufficient, self-reliant communities all over the world in order to gain the economic, emotional, and intellectual independence so they can log out of the system. So the stuff you're doing. And so we want to help scale that. And there's one of my partners has built Emergence, which is a leadership school out of Norway, MBA program, um, and he loses 98% of the graduates to the system, and 2% actually do something meaningful. And so
which is actually a really good success rate for catalysts.
that is true if the catalysts are strong, right?
If they're strong, yes.
So two of them have built youth movements with a couple of 100,000 people all over the globe, which is what I would call a success. Um, but we're now thinking about turning that around, and starting to build true independence right from the beginning, and doing something like the Pirate Academy out of Emergence. So that's where we're at.
Nice. I
And
see lots of points of connection. So this is beautiful. And I can land in my mind, I can land elements of everything you're talking about. Every element of what you've just described is present in part, at least, in the work that I would say I am like a rhizome for.
yeah,
Um, so yes, I can relate to
so
this very well.
beautiful. So I'm really curious how this unfolds, and I will give you space now. So you can just riff on for however long you feel comfortable, and then I will start asking questions if I want to go deeper. But this is your space, right? And you can play with it, and then we just go into a natural conversation over time.
Sounds beautiful. Um,
Cool.
I think I would like to begin with your prompt to give context to
Yeah,
who I
that's
am
good.
and why it is that we are talking.
Hmm.
Because I think people who know you and your work will recognize the shape of the story.
Hmm.
And maybe because of the way that we're talking about facilitating adaptation into emergent futures, that might be good to start my story with just giving it a date. I was born in
Hmm.
1976. And that is important because 1976 was already at least a half century into planetary collapse, into the accelerated destruction of habitats, loss of biodiversity. The great acceleration is often marked around 1950,
Hmm.
but we can look earlier and see that there were up ramping patterns before. So I was born into a time that was very far from normal,
Hmm.
in a geologic or evolutionary sense for humans. And I was also born on a chicken farm, an industrial chicken farm
Hmm.
in the Midwestern United States in Missouri, which means I was a poor working class kid who collected dead birds and did composting with them and various, like, I would say I had emotional connection to a system that I did not like.
Hmm.
Actually, I was very repelled by it,
Hmm.
but it was the livelihood of my family. And
Hmm.
my parents divorced when I was 8 years old. So I had a single mother raising four kids, running a big farm.
Wow.
So what this meant was we had a feeling of struggling to survive
Hmm.
because we made very little money. I mean, in US standards, we made about $14,000 a year for a family of five, which
Wow.
means we were below the poverty level.
Yeah.
We never starved. My mom had a big garden and she took care of us.
Hmm.
And my mom was a very capable person. But the feeling I had was economic precariousness and marginalization, especially as I had a later in life a full ride academic scholarship. I was valedictorian of my class.
Hmm.
But this was at a school that had 100 people in the high school. So
Wow.
there were 32 people in my graduating class. And we knew by the end of middle school that I was valedictorian. I was the only
Mm-hmm.
one still getting straight A's.
Wow.
So, so there's no surprise with that coming. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that that did was it created within me a feeling of being socially estranged or
Mm-hmm.
ostracized. I was the different
Mm-hmm.
kid. I was picked on and bullied. I was the smart kid, the nerd, but I was also in a place that there really weren't supports for people with with, I would say, the way that my personality and my strengths were expressed. Like I was
Mm-hmm.
good in school, but all of my friends that I grew up with dropped out of school and they turned 16 because they hated school. So
Mm-hmm.
I ended up without a social group.
Mm-hmm.
And this ended up having a very interesting consequence when I had 4 years of like a full ride academic scholarship. For one thing, I didn't care about getting a degree. I wasn't concerned about having a job. What I cared about was being able to study anything and everything that I could find that wasn't available on that chicken farm. And the internet, Internet Explorer, and then the web browsers
Mm-hmm.
that where they weren't Unix interfaces for people to get online. All that started in 1994, 1995.
Mm-hmm.
I graduated high school in 1995 and started college in 1995. So the internet really became available to me as I entered college.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant that I went from a very information deprived environment to being like a kid in a candy store.
Mm-hmm.
I worked part time in the university's library, partly so I could learn how libraries work and so I could find access to books and become friends with the reference librarians. And I rejected the idea of creating a degree or selecting a degree. Instead, I initially double majored physics and philosophy, and then realized I could design my own major, could create an interdisciplinary major. And so I studied physics, philosophy, and dance because I had
Wow.
a background in martial arts and theater, and
Mm-hmm.
dance was a natural continuation of just being in my body and moving.
Mm-hmm.
And because I had this full ride scholarship, I learned like Neo in the Matrix, if, for those who remember those movies in the 90s.
Yeah.
There's this line in the Matrix when Morpheus says, some rules can be bent, others can be broken. And what I learned was that organizations are very fluid,
Mm-hmm.
and mostly they're structured by rigid and stupid administrative
Mm-hmm.
systems and human beings who have relationships to each
Mm-hmm.
other. So I would do things like go to the dean of my college and say, I know the maximum independent study credits towards the degree is 6 hours, but I'd like to go beyond that. Could I do that? And they'd say, does your committee agree? Yes. Well, they
Mm-hmm.
trust me. And I would just go outside the bounds
Yeah.
and study whatever I
Mm-hmm.
wanted. And so this created
Because
a,
that's something you were used to already, being outside of the bounds, so it's easier for you to step outside of the bounds.
and also I'm very suffocated within the bounds.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so,
Mm-hmm.
I would feel uncomfortable being inside the normal, the known tracks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And my real interest at that time was it could be encapsulated with chaos theory and complexity science and pattern formation. And because of my physical training in martial arts, theater, and dance, also the meaning making of the body
Mm-hmm.
and how the human mind works. So to jump ahead a little bit, when I was in graduate school, I entered into an atmospheric science program. And that was because I wanted to study complex patterns. And the program I entered was at the University of Illinois, which has a really good research group in complexity. And I vicariously sort of delved into the world of climate science while being in a satellite remote sensing group. So that meant I looked at satellite images of the Earth from space, which creates what's called the overview effect,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
psychological transformation and
So so
intimately
so so
falling in love with the planet.
so the overview effect happened to you by looking at satellite images. So that's enough, you're saying.
It was enough for me
Mm-hmm.
because I grew up on a farm where I escaped into the woods and the rivers to get away from people when I was bullied and
Mm-hmm.
picked on. So I had a
Mm-hmm.
really strong nature connection.
Mm-hmm.
And then seeing the Earth from space, it's just so beautiful that for me,
Mm-hmm.
the satellite images were enough.
Interesting. Yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and also, I saw beauty and I saw horror because I would look at a time lapse of a city encroaching on the surrounding land and cutting down the forest. And I could see this, it could run in my mind these animations of the devastation of the planet
Mm-hmm.
and see it and feel it very
Mm-hmm.
intimately.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what led me to drop out of my PhD program
Mm-hmm.
in atmospheric science after helping create an undergraduate major in Earth systems, environment, and society. So I spent 2 years integrating the social sciences, the humanities, and the Earth system sciences, which
Mm-hmm.
is geology, geography, atmospheric science, civil engineering, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Everything related to the changes of the physical Earth.
Yeah.
And was, in a sense, deeply traumatized by what I learned because I really dove deep into the ecological crisis.
Yeah.
And I came to a recognition that the major problems in the world were caused by the human mind.
Mm-hmm.
And one way I experienced this very viscerally in 2003, and those who are old enough to remember, in March of 2003, the United States, under false pretenses, invaded Iraq
Mm-hmm.
to be able to grab access to oil. And I would watch from my office at the University of Illinois, look outside and see all the students going about their opulent US lives while we were supposed to be at war. And I could feel this dramatic disconnect
Mm-hmm.
between the destruction of the lives of people in the Middle East and what was happening in front of me. And I felt exactly the same disconnect with climate change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That people could live in this perceived normalcy while actually being in significant systemic danger,
Mm-hmm.
but completely unaware.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spoke with a good friend at the time who was doing his PhD in a field, an emerging field then called cognitive anthropology of religion. And he was studying at Oxford, this friend of mine. And he told me, Joe, what you're talking about is cognitive science. There's a field where they figured out how to study this. And so I dropped out of my atmospheric science program and went into cognitive science, but independently, not at a
Mm-hmm.
university.
Okay.
I did that undergraduate interdisciplinary degree, except I later jokingly said that I got a PhD at Joe University because I spent about
Yeah.
2 years after completing my master's
Mm-hmm.
reading 300 or 400 research articles and 80 or 90 books and reaching
Yeah.
out to lead researchers. And this is how I ended up working with George Lakoff. I was a founder of cognitive linguistics,
Mm-hmm.
not at the university where he taught at Berkeley, but instead at his think tank that was set up for studying political discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And so I learned how to study political language, connect it to insights from the cognitive and behavioral sciences, and then try to help social movements to be more successful at achieving their political goals. In the early days, this was progressive politics in the US, which I eventually found to be just such a corrupt and broken system that there wasn't much I could do there. And a few years later, it was more in the realm of understanding the creation of poverty and inequality and how they relate to environmental destruction, working with a group called The Rules. I was the framing strategist for The Rules for 5 years, which meant we worked with frontline activist groups and social movements
Mm-hmm.
like La Via Campesino and like La Via Campesina in Mexico, and groups in Kenya trying to fight against tax havens and taxes on commodity crops, which would create Arab Spring types of issues. And we were working with
Yeah.
those kinds of movements um, for several years. And what I came to through all of this, and this relates, I think, to what we're going to talk about for the rest of our time today, is I now describe it as I spent 15 years trying to find a viable, like a defensible, an empirically defensible path to a sustainable human presence on Earth. And I kept discarding false promises.
Mhm.
Like, oh, electric cars are going to make the planet sustainable. Well, here are 10 things that are wrong with that. And, and when I kept casting out possible futures, um, I came to realize that there was something I had to let go of,
Mhm.
which is I had to let go of my fear of a future that involved the collapse of human civilization.
Mhm.
And in doing that, and I really started publicly taking this stance in 2017 when I started writing about planetary collapse.
Mhm. Mhm.
And planetary collapse is different from societal collapse. So that's
Mhm.
something I can
Mhm.
name and we can delve into if we like. But planetary collapse, in some senses, started with the Neolithic Revolution and the birth of agriculture.
Okay.
Um, and I heard William Catton, who's a planetary ecologist, he once framed this well in his book Overshoot, that agriculture is the forced imposition, a human management system that forces an ecosystem to remain in the pioneering stage. So if you understand ecosystems and how ecosystems can start out in a degraded environment where there are pioneering species that colonize the landscape, and then again, eventually there's ecological succession where niches form and biodiversity increases, and eventually the ecosystem, if it's able to, becomes what's called a climax ecosystem and it's self-sustaining. That
Mhm.
agriculture is the destruction of ecological succession
Mhm.
to return the landscape back to the pioneering stage over and over again.
Mhm.
So you cut down your monoculture crops and then you reintroduce and plant new monoculture crops. And the
Mhm.
reason they grow quickly and they have high productive yield is because they're pioneering species. And so this is sort of a metaphor for what civilizations do. Civilizations simplify their ecological settings by converting, thermodynamically converting the complexity of landscapes and ecosystems into social complexity until they
Mhm.
undermine their capacity to maintain that complexity.
Mhm.
For those who
Mhm.
are familiar, Joseph Tainter describes this process extremely well. He's an archaeologist who looks at societal collapses. And then eventually civilizations collapse because of this complexity disconnect, that they degrade the ecological foundations of society to such an extent that they cannot manage the cascade of problems and the civilization collapses. And there are various triggers and specific ways this occurs, but this always occurs. And so what I came to realize was that civilizations must collapse and get out of the way for sustainable pathways to become possible.
Mhm.
And that sustainable pathways for humans have existed for the full duration of our species history, but they've always existed as hunter-gatherer societies. So what this means now is we have an interesting possibility that we need to design what are functionally similar to hunter-gatherer societies, but
Mhm.
design them into an extremely chaotic period of dynamic change for the planet,
Mhm.
which is not how hunter-gatherer societies evolved in the past.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so this is a new challenge space, even though
Wow.
we're drawing on a lot of old things that
Mm.
are elements of it.
Yeah.
Uh, so maybe that's enough
Wow.
to give sense and
That's
context.
that's I literally apart from some distractions because people were walking around, I literally had to physically keep my mouth shut because there were so many points where I wanted to get off on a tangent, and it was a really thorough and beautiful description of what totally resonates with me in terms of where we're at, why we are there, and where we should be headed. So thank you for that. It's amazing, really.
Yeah,
Um,
you're
and
welcome.
so so but that's you already built the bridge into the main question for today.
Thank you. Yeah, the
So
conversation that I think we all
yeah,
need to be having, and it's beautiful that my daughter just showed up to hand me something um, because there's a lesson from evolution and from the work
yeah,
of Charles Darwin that will relate to this discussion we're about to have of
yeah.
creating functioning human societies. And that is that evolution occurs in two ways that are extremely important. One of them is it's intergenerational.
Mm-hmm,
It is what is inherited
mm-hmm,
and changing in either environments that are changing or environments that are stable.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And it's also statistical diversity of possible things to inherit, which
mm-hmm,
means it's at a population level, not at
mm-hmm,
an individual level.
mm-hmm,
And so this is why population genetics is what enabled biological evolution to become Darwinian. They couldn't
mm-hmm,
track the natural selection of traits unless they had good statistics for populations.
mm-hmm,
This happened in the 1920s. And the intergenerational element brings about a very interesting component, which is the connection between what biologists call phylogeny and, ontogeny, which is basically technical words for development across the lifespan or intergenerational change or ancestry.
mm-hmm.
And so ancestry and developmental change are both in play in biology. And here we have a challenge of developing human beings across their lifespan, developing economies and societies across their lifespan, while also creating intergenerational or inheritance types of change. We need to do both at once.
Okay, so
Um,
that is the platform you're coming from, right? So now let's what's the reason why we're doing this in a very practical way, trying to have this conversation in a very practical way, is it is so beautiful to build these 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 pieces of art, mind art, in these types of conversations, which happens in all of these amazing conversations that happen on the game B, and future thinkers and rebel wisdom and the meta modernists and all of that amazing stuff, right? But here we'd like to look at the practicality of things. Like, you're on the ground somewhere on the planet and you're building a physical community, right? People coming together or being together, they need to have shelter, they need to have something to eat, maybe clothes. They want to have some intergenerational dialogue, they want to teach stuff, they want to learn stuff, they want to understand or get closer to truth, maybe they want to love, they want to do all of these things, very practical stuff. um, and so the question is, when you look at that from all of your background, with all of your knowledge and experience, um, and putting yourself into the mental space of you're somewhere out there, you're building this community, and you are physically there. We know that, so it's much should be easy for you. But putting yourself into that space, imagining what it is like, um, and then looking at what is it that you want to take consciously from the current mode of civilization with you. What do you want to avoid? What do you invent as a new thing? How do you structure this, in on a general level, but also on your personal individual level? What do you bring to the table? Where do you feel most alive, and what is your life's contribution to this in this community, and how do you flesh all of this out, so in very practical terms?
what's interesting is my wife and I have been living this question in a very
Mm-hmm,
concrete way for at least 4 years. as our daughter is about to turn 4,
Mhm.
and in a partial way for about 10 years before that. And so I will share how we came to the place we're in now as a way of starting to see what we're bringing with us and what we're keeping out. Because we moved from, we were living in Costa Rica a year ago, a little more than a year ago. Before that, we lived in Eugene, Oregon. And before that, we were in Seattle. And our journey was one that started in Seattle when our daughter was born. She was born there. Very expensive place to live, very difficult to separate ourselves from the neoliberal, extractive, globalized economy, and very little capacity to be parents and have a child. We couldn't own a house, rent is really high. We would both need to work full time. Then we'd have to pay a lot of money to put our child in daycare, and we'd have to compete for daycares because on and on and on. And so we moved to Eugene, Oregon when our daughter was 4 months old to have a little bit more financial freedom in a less expensive place where only one of us was working, but I was able to work from home so we could be full-time parents. This is part of what we're bringing with us is the ability to have time for family. And what we're leaving behind is the rat race of debt and being stuck in an economy that's just sucking all life from everyone. And that wasn't enough, but it was a start. When we moved to Costa Rica, we went off-grid into a permaculture type of setting, a regenerative project, an eco hotel called Rancho Margot. And what we brought with us was a global network. I brought about 1,000 books for a research library, which are currently sitting in boxes in San Jose, and I haven't been able to move them to Colombia yet. And so I was bringing knowledge, and I was bringing an online connection to a global network with my own social networks. And what we were getting away from, what we were leaving behind was the city and the lifestyle of the city. There were other things too, but those were big things. And we were putting our daughter into a biodiversity hotspot. So we were leaving degraded environments and entering wholesome, intact ecosystems. Where we were living had more than 600 species of bird, probably 10,000 species of insects. And it was just, our daughter would come in the house and say, look at this flower. And we're like, that's a hallucinogenic flower that'll make you temporarily go blind if you touch it and touch your eyes. And our daughter was 2. And she's like, look at the cute spider. And it's like, that's the world's deadliest spider. And so we had some interesting parenting challenges, but it was very concrete and it all worked out. But it was not the right place for us because there wasn't community to support us as a family. There weren't other children there. We had some structural incompatibilities between being in what was effectively a hotel and the kind of family life that we needed to have for ourselves. And so we went searching further. And when we came to Colombia, to Barichara, which is a village with 6,000 people in the northern Andes, we came here because this is a place that has a very strong local culture. About 70% of the food that's eaten here is from local farms. So it has a food shed that's very strong. It has arts and crafts culture for natural fibers and textiles. If you see behind me, baskets and other things that are made from native plants. A lot of capacity for subsistence living. And also a community reforestation project that we were able to connect to. Other parents who wanted to raise their children in the same way. And when we arrived, one of the things we chose to keep out was the hubris of thinking we somehow knew what the solutions were. So we very carefully, in the ethic of permaculture, we came here as observers and volunteers to participate in other people's projects, to listen and to learn, and to not have our own agenda. Which meant that the children, because we arrived into a forest school for children between the age of 2 and 7, and we met about a dozen families this way. We entered into the agenda of raising children among all of these parents. And we did this immersed in a community reforestation project in a place where the native tropical dry forest of this region has been 98% destroyed. This is a type of ecosystem that's on the verge of extinction in the world. Tropical dry forests are very special connections between other kinds of ecosystems. And they're almost all destroyed because they're in landscapes that are suitable for agriculture, but are also marginal soils, meaning after a little bit of agriculture, the agriculture goes away too, and then you're just left with what becomes a desert.
Mm.
So this is a landscape that's going to become a desert
Mm.
unless humans intervene. And this starts to further give us a context in which we can see what we need to bring, which is we need to bring my background training in atmospheric science and satellite remote sensing.
Mhm, mhm,
So I would do things like stand up on the cliff and look down in the valley and watch fog forming over the river below. I studied cloud physics in graduate school. So I could see cloud formation.
mhm,
And then I could see these hot, dry areas between patches of forest where the fog would dissipate, the clouds would evaporate. And I could see a broken ecology and a broken hydrology. So I brought this Earth systems perspective, this scientific knowledge of the physical chemistry of the atmosphere and the landscape ecology of continuous forest. Now it relates to cloud formation.
just a question. I don't want to go off on a tangent
Yeah.
here, but just a question to this. Um, the way you're describing it is you bringing this knowledge from a science-based background. I would have the intuition that people who have lived in this environment intuitively or over generations would have built a body of knowledge that we wouldn't call science in the way we look at science today in our Western cultures, but they would see the same things as you would. Is that possible, or is
I
I'm
would
on the
say
wrong
that
path?
is not only is it possible, it is evident in the local people.
Okay.
But the problem is intergenerational amnesia, which is
Mm-hmm.
that just as happening everywhere in the world, the young people from the countryside go to the city.
Mm-hmm.
The knowledge becomes fragmented and the local knowledge is lost.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see here, even though there's an incredible amount of local knowledge in the art and craft culture, which
Mm-hmm.
is connected to the native forest because it's stone construction for houses and earthen construction with soil and clay, and it's using rocks, or I'm sorry, it's using wood from native trees and from native grasses to grow, to build the buildings, and natural fibers for the clothing, and things like this. There's a lot of this that's still present, and it's
Mm-hmm.
present because of tourism.
Mm-hmm.
Tourists come and they buy these local arts and crafts, and because the campesinos use it to survive. When they don't have money, they build their own things or construct their own things. And this is a place that was an island of stability during a 57-year civil war in Colombia with a lot of violence. There was much less violence in this specific region because of the mountains. It's fairly remote and difficult to access. It's a real blend. But what happened here is that the knowledge has been disappearing throughout the last 3, maybe 4 generations of campesinos, but it's still here in a fragmented way,
Mm-hmm.
which means that a lot of it can be recovered, but it won't be maintained with the extractive economy that has taken hold here. And tourism really became prominent in the village of Barichara about 15 years ago. It was designated as a national monument. And so it's a very popular place for tourism within Colombia, even though it's not widely known outside of Colombia. It's an absolutely beautiful, think of a 16th century Spanish colonial village in the northern Andes. It's just a beautiful place.
Mm-hmm.
The indigenous people were driven to extinction 300 years ago, which creates a paradoxical effect that there are no local people who are conquered. The people here were not conquered. And as a result, the campesinos are campesinos. They're not second class people who learned to be second class by living within a colonial system. It means there's a lot more self reliance and
Hmm.
resilience
Hmm. Hmm.
among the campesino people here than there are in other parts of Latin America.
Hmm.
So it's an interesting set of nuances in the landscape. But what I see is, especially as it relates to water, a lot of the cultural knowledge has been lost. And the way I see that is I see how the farmers dig holes to make ponds to have water because there's a rainy season. During the rain season, the rain comes hard. But because the forest is gone, when the rain comes hard, it runs and takes the remaining soil with it. And now we have hard packed clay and massive erosion. And so the farmers that are here, there are exceptions, but the norm is most of them have no idea about water retention. And they build these big circular ponds, which increases evaporation and destroys what's left of the topsoils because they don't know how to do water retention.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And because of tourism and what tourism has done, it has enabled people to succeed economically with independent businesses, which undermines the history of cooperation that was here before with local community organizations, cooperatives, which were very strong for about 60 years up till the 1990s.
Hmm.
And what that means is that people are not looking at the landscape as a system anymore, less and less. More and more, they're looking at their own little business and how do they serve the tourists to make money the next time the tourists come. And
Hmm.
as a result, there's a kind of forgetting that has occurred.
Hmm. And you choose to go there. So, uh, uh, um, our idea is maybe it's easier to go somewhere fresh. So, somewhere into the forest, onto the land, whether that's Finland or whether it's Latin America, and start fresh instead of working with an existing community and helping that community get out of the trap that you're describing or not even fall into the trap. But you've actively chosen to um, go into a community and apparently help the community get out of the trap. Um, why do you choose that path and over the other option going into the forest?
The main reason is that evolution works through uh, intergenerational inheritance. It's evolution, not revolution.
Hmm.
And evolution is a process of building upon what came before in a direction that increases the adaptive capability of the culture in a changing environment. So as the environment changes, what used to be functional can become maladaptive. And so there's a need to work with what is adaptive in a place to have an understanding of that, which it helps to have beginner's eyes.
Hmm.
It helps to actually be an outsider and to look in like an anthropologist would and
Hmm.
say, in this place, I see how you function because I didn't just inherit this cultural way of being as a child with no understanding of its function. I come as an outsider who sees the culture as strange and bizarre and confusing and have
Hmm.
to learn how it works, which
Hmm.
includes, in my case, getting better at my Spanish and
Hmm.
learning another language. But but there's a real benefit of analyzing a system as an outsider to be able to come to an understanding of the system and then to work with people inside the system who also have come to an understanding of it because there are bridge opportunities there that create new insights.
So that ties back into the notion of uh, we have to use the whole body of knowledge. So all of the hunter-gatherer knowledge that we have, the knowledge that we've built during the extractive period over the last 10,000 years and primarily so over the last 200 years, um, put all of that together in order to be able to navigate this uh, turmoil, planetary turmoil that we're headed towards. Um, and if I'm hearing you correctly, then um, you're saying it's better to start somewhere where there's a higher probability um, of or there's more diversity in cultural diversity. It's harder to integrate all of that, but as you do so, you build more resiliency or even anti-fragility.
Yeah, and I remember something in a conversation 2 years ago that I had with Jordan Greenhall,
Mhm.
who's a member of he's
Yeah.
associated with the Game B community, and the intellectual dark web, as it was called for a little while.
Hmm.
Um, he was telling me about some complex systems analysis that they were doing, some computer simulations,
Hmm.
to find scenarios that can avoid human extinction when there
Hmm.
are existential threats, things
Hmm.
that could cause human extinction. And one of the things that he found as a criteria was a blend of being far enough away from an international airport that
Hmm.
you're not deeply entrenched in the globalized system,
Hmm.
but being close enough to an international airport that you get the benefits of globalized knowledge.
Hmm.
And this creates a sweet spot that if you're roughly 3 to 5 hours from an international airport, then you have this blend of some people are connected to the global system, but
Hmm.
move this far out. And you can access, in a half a day, you could drive, if you have a car, you could drive to a university, for example, or a research lab. And this for me is a really interesting way of thinking.
Hmm.
Where we are right now, we're 4 hours from the international airport in Bucaramanga and eight
Hmm.
hours from Bogota. We're in a village with 6,000 people.
Hmm.
But one of my friends who lives here is a Colombian computer scientist who works for the British Space Agency,
Hmm.
looking at land system change, studying satellite data. So
Hmm.
we're in a
Hmm.
place, we're in this remote village in the mountains, but we have people like this guy, or people like
Hmm.
myself and my wife who are
Hmm.
here. But the majority of people here are local people from here. So you have a really authentic and deep culture that evolved in this landscape, but you also have sufficient connection to the globalized system and its knowledge base that you can do
So
things
so
like access this kind of knowledge.
so you need and it's a that's an interesting point. If I look at this idea that I first heard from Alexander Bard of the there's an inner circle, you could call it the feminine of inner organization. Then there's a binding circle between this and a circle of the hunters, the usually the masculine going out and doing exploring, hunting and building, and then there's an outer ring of 4% of binders to other communities, the shamans.
Mm.
So that's that 3.5 hour distance to the airport could translate in a natural 4% shaman rate,
Yeah,
including you as a binding element, shamanistic binding element to the global sphere of knowledge, global body of knowledge, and translator into the community for re-understanding what needs to be re-understood.
yeah. And as a very concrete example, we started a process in August
Mm-hmm.
to um, to create what is going to become a new nature reserve. And the way this process started was we have a good friend, and we're friends with this person because her son is about our daughter's age, and we met in the forest school.
Mm-hmm.
And she lives in a part of the territory that is close to Barichara, but it's about 20 minutes drive away. It's only 4 kilometers, but it's a rough road, so you drive slowly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's in a ridge line that's 5 kilometers in length, connecting Barichara to the nearby village of Villanueva. And
Mm-hmm.
this ridge line has a system of aquifers, groundwater,
Mm-hmm.
which historically provided the groundwater supply to the village of Barichara. At the
Mm-hmm.
very top of this aquifer system is a 3 hectare piece of land that is heavily degraded, serious erosion. All the trees were cut down a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And our friend took us to visit this land. And when I arrived on the land, I had an immediate emotional connection. This
Mm-hmm.
land is very degraded,
Mm-hmm.
highly visible in its location, highly strategic ecologically and geologically. It's for sale, and we might be able to protect it
Wow.
and
Mm-hmm.
regenerate it. So I took pictures, I posted them on Facebook and said, I would love to help decolonize and regenerate this land. Imagine a
Mm-hmm.
forest here.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I wasn't asking for money, I received $10,000 in donations in the next 24 hours from friends who wanted to see me go to the owners and try to buy this land. And so that started a negotiation. And here you can see the blend of the global system and the
Mm-hmm.
capacities of people from Europe and North America who had the kind of money to donate to me in that, here's $1,000, here's $50 sort of way, that I could start a dialogue with my friend who's the neighbor to the owners of the land, to start a
Mm-hmm.
conversation of building trust and becoming friends with them, to
Mm-hmm.
explore if we could create a reforestation project on this land.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the story of how we've gotten from there to here is quite interesting, but I think it's a little, oh, you're getting me wet. Thank you. At least spraying water. Oh, I love it. Um, the story is itself is interesting, but I think it's a digression from what we're talking about now. The theme we're talking about now is how this capacity to have a planetary perspective and a connection to a globalized network, of a large, diverse social network, enables me to do things like recruit money into the system.
Mm-hmm.
And recruiting money is often actually more destructive than helpful
Yeah.
because there's not this interface where you have a membrane of trust
Mm-hmm.
within the
Mm-hmm.
local community that converts the money and the power of the money into a
Into
local context in which it can be applied appropriately.
yeah. Yeah.
But but here we have that because we're creating a local foundation. We've
Mm-hmm.
formed a local team of people in the village of Barichara who are leaders of regenerative projects that were here before we arrived.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's not like the gringo came with his ideas and his money.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
the gringo arrived, listened and observed, and made friends for a year,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
now knows who to gather. That if we're going to have some money, we can form
Mm-hmm.
a team that has this local contextual knowledge and deep relationships with the campesino culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started designing criteria for how would we use money that comes from the outside,
Mm-hmm.
not just for this piece of land, because we later started in early December, started creating a bioregional investment platform and have started crowdfunding.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're doing crowdfunding, blended investment, and donations to complete the purchase of this piece of land and have a budget for local regenerative projects that will be given directly to members of the community. And this is possible because there are local people who have been here for years doing projects of various kinds:
Mm-hmm.
water retention, agroforestry, um, preserving and sharing cultural knowledge of how to process native plants for food and medicine, and other a diversity of things related to a regenerative economy. And so that means we can take the connection to the outside world and transform it as it enters,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so that it is only allowed to enter in ways that local people with contextualized knowledge can determine is appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To me,
And
this
this
sounds
blend
like
is really, really important.
a very active translation of the Ethan Roland concept of the 8 forms of capital. So you're very
Yes.
consciously taking financial capital, turning it, in this case, into material and living capital. Um, Maybe even some intellectual and cultural capital along the way. Um, it's very I find a very interesting concept, to follow what financial capital turns into within this concept. And it seems like, with your holistic systems view, you do that type of conversion naturally.
Yeah.
Is that possible? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I have a lot of experience just in a sense. It's like if you study physics, you learn that
Mm.
everything is energy.
Yeah.
And then you also, if you study enough physics, you learn that everything is information.
Mm-hmm.
And information is just a way of describing the distribution of energy and how it relates to
Mm-hmm.
other, how all of the energy relates
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
interdependently. And then that way of thinking makes it quite natural, or intuitive, maybe is a better word, to convert capitals.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we're doing that is very explicit in our design is we're creating a portfolio of projects around ecological connectivity in the territory.
Mm-hmm.
So we're taking the natural information of organization for the landscapes,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're organizing existing human projects. Here's a reforestation project. Here
Mm-hmm.
is a coffee plantation with agroforestry. Here is a
Mm-hmm.
women's group that makes baskets,
Mm-hmm.
because this is a representation of information and knowledge. But we organize them with maps of the territory.
Mm-hmm.
You're part of this drainage basin. You're part of this aquifer system. You're part of this ecological corridor of forest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And by connecting it in this way, not only do we convert one form of capital into all the others, but we do it with connectivity that is aligned with ecological reality.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
in doing this, we can create a financial system that measures whole system health.
Mm-hmm.
And the engine of the whole thing is not money. And this is the irony of it all. We might call it a fund, and we actually did.
Mm-hmm.
We called it the Barichar Regeneration Fund, but
Mm-hmm.
it's actually a learning system.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that drives all change is learning, it's education.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do we
Mm-hmm.
learn by mapping? What do we learn by running projects? What do we learn by convening people? What do we learn with these facilitated processes of emergence?
Learning also includes the question for storage of learned
Mm,
material, learned information, and transferal of the same, which which could be a bridge into something that I'm very curious about, that you touched upon earlier, which is the intergenerational aspects to all of this. Because right now, the way I understand what you're describing is that you're, um, through your supernode connector shamanic role, you are rebuilding the body of knowledge that's necessary to for this community to be truly independent and adaptable, or anti-fragile. But
yes. A nice example for us is my daughter coming with a native tree, which
yeah,
has this type of bean that you can, that people like to eat here. Just has a physical precursor of what we're about to talk about.
yes, yes. Hello,
Want to say
hello.
hi, Elliot?
Thank you for showing.
So yeah, this tree is called kuhi, and it's, oh, mesquite is another name for it. And you don't swallow it, but you chew on it and suck
Okay,
out the juices as the pod.
nice.
Or you can squeeze it and make juice with it. Um, so a physical demonstration of what we are about to talk about.
Yes, beautiful timing.
um, yeah. You want to eat some kuhi with me? Okay. Because one of the parts of this that is most important is to normalize for the children
Mm-hmm.
what needs to happen for the next 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the next 200 years is going to be a time of ecosystem restoration and regeneration of everything that we can possibly regenerate. So this means children need to feel like it's just normal that all of the adults gather native seeds. All of the adults set up tree nurseries. All of the adults grow forest. All of the adults learn arts and crafts and food production and medicine production from those native plants. All adults heal, clean, and restore the health of rivers.
Mm-hmm.
It's just what adults do, which means this is just what the children do and it's normal for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And by doing this, we make the children a reservoir of knowledge, values, ethics, practical skills that will grow up into a conscience, a mindset of care and stewardship.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an essential piece of carrying this work forward beyond the time of 10 or 20 years. Or, for those of us like myself, I'm in my mid 40s. I might get really lucky and get another 40 or 50 years of work
Mm-hmm.
participating in this work.
Mm-hmm.
But this is longer time scale than that. So it's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely essential that the children grow up to be adults continuing this work and their
Mm-hmm.
children do the same. And this is a very important piece. And this gets at one of the fundamental problems of the modern world, which is that the modern world is built on an economy that requires us to make everyone into workers,
Mm-hmm.
which means it requires us to destroy families so the economy can work.
Mm-hmm.
The parents send their kids off to daycare or to industrial schools or nature based schools, but still the children and parents are separate.
Mm-hmm.
And what we need, and this is a hunter gatherer model, is we need to bring the children back into an immersion of the adult world with multiple age groups.
Mm-hmm.
And, and in doing that, we have a very well evolved and adapted learning system for human
Mm-hmm.
culture.
Mm-hmm.
Younger kids learn from older kids, older kids imitate young adults, et cetera, et cetera.
Are there some aspects of what you just called the modern world that you feel sad about leaving behind in this 200-year path? Is
Yeah,
there
there are
something you're
several
missing?
things.
Yeah.
One thing that we just don't know what is truly going to be possible to maintain as the planetary collapse process runs its course and brings the globalized economy to an end. One thing that's really beautiful about cities is cosmopolitanism. The
Mm-hmm.
fact that I can go to a city and I can have Chinese food or Vietnamese food or French food and experience diverse cultures in one place.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know how much of that is going to be preserved as
Mm-hmm.
we move back to primarily regional economies.
Mm-hmm.
Because the primary limitation is the set of costs for long distance travel.
Mm-hmm.
If we go back to, for example, wind travel, where we have ships with big sails that move across the ocean, even with really advanced technology, it might be 1 or 2 weeks from one city
Mm-hmm.
to another,
Mm-hmm.
instead of now where you can jump on an airplane and be there the next day.
Mm-hmm.
And so this this potential for losing the connectivity, the geographically diverse connectivity, and all of the benefits that that brings is something that I feel not just my generation, but people roughly between 1950 and around 2050, we've mostly squandered. So much
Mm-hmm.
has been wasted with all that
Mm-hmm.
we've been so privileged to gain and have
Mm-hmm.
taken for granted. Some of us don't take it for granted, but the majority of people do who
But
benefit from it.
isn't there one dimension more to that than enjoying the cultural diversity of a city that is generated by shamanic overload because you have like 2 3 airports in the city? Um, isn't that exactly what enables you and your role at the moment? So when that breaks away, and maybe even along with the collapse of the various systems, the also the communication possibility that we're enjoying right now breaks away, then that diminishes what somebody like you can do in a community. So
Yeah.
actually, that is something that is crucial to preserve, or to form into something else. Like, as you say, a network of shamans sailing the planet exchange ideas and recipes and all of these ideas.
Yeah. One of the key ideas that is vital for the success of this work was articulated by the Balaton group, which is the group that formed around the limits to growth study in the
Mm-hmm,
early 1970s. And it's based on the name of Lake Balaton in Hungary, where they had their first meeting.
mm-hmm,
And the Balaton group existed for about 10 years. And in 1983, Dana Meadows, who
mm-hmm,
was lead author of the Limits to Growth study and as a member of this group, she wrote a brief essay called A Brief History of the Balaton Group.
mm-hmm,
And in this essay, she said that after 10 years of inquiry, we're going to live on a planet that has ecological limits.
mm-hmm,
What do we need to do to create sustainability? And they found that they needed to create local living economies, and each local living economy needs to have a bioregional learning center, at least
mm-hmm,
one.
mm-hmm,
So, this idea of bioregional learning centers, of basically learning how to learn to be
mm-hmm,
able to live in a place as
mm-hmm,
an entire economy,
mm-hmm,
is vital. But the thing that's missing from that is to have a planetary network of these
mm-hmm,
bioregional learning centers.
mm-hmm,
And the way I frame this in a way that they couldn't have in the early 1970s is I like to use the planetary boundaries framework from Stockholm Resilience Center.
mm-hmm,
And this is that there are 9 Earth systems processes that need to be within a self sustaining range for there to be a globalized human presence on Earth.
mm-hmm,
And we've already crossed at least 4 of them.
mm-hmm,
Climate change is only one.
mm-hmm,
And if we look at them, the ones that we've crossed include land systems change, which is the destruction of ecosystems, um, the cycling of nitrogen and phosphorus, which is
mm-hmm,
connected to the industrial food production, biodiversity loss or the rate of extinction, which
mm-hmm,
is the most likely one to drive humans to extinction.
mm-hmm,
And then climate change is number 4.
mm-hmm,
Um, and then you have ocean acidification and ozone hole and other things that are also present. But what's interesting about this planetary systems way of thinking is that we need to bring those processes back within some kind of balance
mm-hmm,
for the human presence to continue on Earth. And that means we need to have a measurement framework that marks our progress. So, how well are we capturing carbon and putting it back into living ecosystems? How well are we maintaining and regrowing biodiversity? How well are we reducing reactive nitrogen from nitrogen fertilizers and instead having local healthy soils and healthy waterways and so on with this planetary perspective? And for us to have regional economies that are resilient, then we need a planetary system that is able to have regional economies. And so, in climate chaos that we're entering into with abrupt climate change and with biodiversity loss and the great extinction event that we're in, um, could cause human extinction.
mm-hmm,
It's a possibility. To safeguard against that, we need to have a planetary network of these local economies. So we need to have a learning ecosystem that is organized as bioregional economies, but is also organized as a planetary network.
mm-hmm,
And this piece relates directly to what you were saying about the shamans traveling from place to place. So now we have another way of saying the same thing, is
mm-hmm,
that we can have territorial representation for bioregional learning.
mm-hmm,
How do you learn to live within a bioregional economy in one place? And then how do you bring that learning to another place?
mm-hmm.
And this is what we're doing with the Earth Regenerators platform that formed around a book manuscript I started writing a year ago. And I decided to create a study group for the book. And then it became a network that now has 2,400 members to try to live out the, the design pathway for regenerating Earth, which was the name of the book. And so now we're organizing around bioregional economies and this global network of sharing. And so this piece, it relates to what we talked about a little bit at the beginning of our conversation when we were just chatting about the Emergence School, the Pirate Academy, and things like this that you're doing, and what it means to cultivate internal personal capacities, and this Bildung, this philosophy of character development for people. And the book, The Nordic Secret, is a great starting point to look at the success in a previous transition for this, to take that way of thinking and connect it to what you talked about with horizon building or assessing emerging horizons. One way of assessing emerging horizons is to see what is or is not working from one territory to another. Because one horizon that we need to worry about, and we need to worry a great deal about, is named in the work of Peter Turchin. Peter Turchin is a population ecologist, a mathematical biologist at the University of Connecticut. He's Russian, but he's in the United States. And he helped create the field of cleodynamics, the mathematical study of history. And in his study of civilizations, in the mathematical modeling of civilizations, he observed a phenomenon that is sometimes called the frontier effect, which the positive version of the frontier effect is exploring into the frontier, go to Alaska, go to the moon, etc. The negative version, the harm to a civilization, is the invasion that happens in the frontier. And if you look at the Roman Empire as an example, which is primarily Mediterranean, it enters into Europe, but it's primarily Southern Europe and Mediterranean. And what's interesting is that there was a renewal of cooperation within the Roman Empire after a period of it becoming more internally divided, higher inequality, degradation of solidarity. But then there would be an invasion of the tribes of Germany, the invasion of the Hun, of Attila the Hun and people from the Mongolian steppe. And as they would invade, it would increase internal solidarity and cooperation to fight against the invading hordes. So this frontier effect is really interesting because for bioregional economies, there are two ways of dealing with the outside invaders. One is to cooperate so well internally that you can outcompete them in warfare. And the other is to convert them into trade partners and form federations of trade. Both of these are long-term strategies for success of a social entity or a way of organizing a polity, as sometimes they're called. So for the sake of these bioregional economies, they need to learn how to create trade networks for larger scale intra-bioregional cooperation, and also internally to have strong enough bioregional identities to mobilize for warfare when it's necessary against invaders from the outside. And one of the biggest threats to bioregional economies in the next 50 years, as it has been for the last 50 years, is nation states. As the United States mobilizes to invade what are basically tribal networks in Afghanistan, as one example, or tribal networks in Iraq, where the country of Iraq was drawn by the spoils of war by nation states at the end of World War II. The big threat to bioregional economies for the near term is invasion from nation states. And so it's an interesting thing to just try to hold the incredible complexity of what this implies. But this is a realm of very important design work.
Yeah, there's as we're describing this, one, I think, a very important question for me arose in this, which is there's always polarity to everything you do. And based on the context you're in, something might be more to the positive or more to the negative side. Um, and in what you earlier called climate chaos, which is a pointer to that constantly and probably radically, continuously for the next at least 200 years, maybe if we accept that time frame, changing environments, we need to be constantly aware of all of that complexity and hold that complexity, evaluate that against our knowledge, actions, skills, our whole ways of knowing and acting, and integrate that on a local, regional, and global level. That requires a whole new way of being in the world.
Yeah. And you can see how this is different from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
which is important, even though a lot of the local organization of culture will look a lot like a hunter-gatherer culture.
Mm-hmm. But then the question becomes, um, how do you evolve this kind of mindset? So it took you, let's say, I'm just picking a number, or me, 20 years to evolve that mindset in a environment that wasn't really welcoming to that type of thinking or nurturing. Is it possible to do this with children in a way that they are capable of this really, um, even running out of words to describe what that kind of mindset would be, but to that high complexity mindset that is necessary for that.
Well,
What's your take on that?
one thing that came out of a lot of public health research in the United States, where the Department of the departments or National Institutes of Health have put a lot of money in, is to study adverse childhood experiences,
Mm-hmm.
and how there's this set of environmental factors or social factors that together create all kinds of social problems,
Mm-hmm.
domestic violence, addictive behaviors, you know, pick your flavor.
Mm-hmm.
And the insight from adverse childhood experiences is that what you really need are nurturing environments.
Mm-hmm.
Nurturing environments defined with clarity about what it means. So, for example, you need environments that really support the social and emotional development of the children. And so there are factors that are known that are connected to that. And then there are things related to two key psychological capacities, which is the regulation of emotions and
Mm-hmm.
psychological flexibility, the ability
Mm-hmm.
to take different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And there are frameworks and tools that are now very rigorously studied in a variety of contexts that show how to cultivate this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give the best researched example
Mm-hmm.
because this shows what can be done in a fairly short amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a framework that's called the PAX, PAX, Good Behavior Game. Thank you, Lisa, another one. And the PAX Good Behavior Game started as the word PAX suggests, it started as a conflict resolution and peace building exercise. But then after 20 years of applying it in about 15,000 schools in more than 10 different countries in a variety of different contexts and doing literature reviews of the research and et cetera, like a huge amount of work, it's now known very clearly how to cultivate pro-social capabilities in children
Mm-hmm.
and help them to achieve what Eleanor Ostrom found about how to manage a common pooled asset. And so now there are a lot of schools that bring this good behavior game to second graders and create self-governing classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sharing this just as a framework to say anyone who wants
Mm-hmm.
to practice doing this with children, this is a really good toolkit to use.
Mm-hmm.
But it also shows that what you can do in the span of 2 or 3 months with a group of children is you can teach the children how to manage their own behaviors so that they are monitoring for good behaviors and bad behaviors, that they define the frameworks of what is good and bad behavior for the context of their group. And then they cultivate emotional and psychological capacities to be effective group members by learning how to manage these behaviors individually and together in groups. And so
and
this
also
way of
and
doing things.
also and also be reflective about it. So embedding the capacity to change these behaviors and this entire framework if necessary.
Yeah, it's actually, if you look in an area of contextual behavioral science that's called
Mm-hmm.
acceptance and commitment therapy,
Mm-hmm.
um, the key thing is the ability to notice, back to mindfulness 101, the ability to notice the internal feelings, values, norms, ideals that you have, to
Mm-hmm.
notice when your behaviors diverge from them or align with them,
Mm-hmm.
and in noticing, to be able to accept what you notice and
Mm-hmm.
commit to more of what you want and less of what you don't want. And there's a set of tools from acceptance and commitment therapy that do this really well.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is just another framework example, because there are many frameworks that do this. This just is
Mm-hmm.
one framework that does it. But the key to all of this is that, in a theoretical sense, it's relational frame theory. But relational frame theory points to a very specific thing, which is that the ability to relate to parts of your own identity, which is artificially a sense of separation. I notice me doing something is an
Mm-hmm.
I me separation. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, is artificial in one sense, but this ability to relate to different parts of ourselves is why it is possible to moderate and change our behavior. And that is fundamental to all of the mindfulness practices and contemplative practices. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
key insight from contextual behavioral science. And specifically, the most important relational frame, the identity relationship, is the present self to future self.
Mm-hmm.
And there's really good research on this. If it's Friday night and I'm invited to go drinking with my friends and have a big exam on Monday, if I can take on psychological flexibility to consider different future scenarios and emotion regulation, the ability to say, I really want to go drinking with my friends tonight, but I'm going to not follow that impulse and instead I'm going to study because I want to perform well on my exams. Oh, we can all of them. Huh? Well, there's that one. You can eat that one. Okay. But with you. Okay, we can share it. Thank you. Yummy. You want some? And this ability to relate present self to future self
Mm-hmm.
is foundational for behavior change.
Now, now, the best way to learn something is by learning from other humans, and the way children do that is by looking at adults, and and so that means that the environment around those children must reflect what you just described, which is to say that the adults must live in that way. Now
Yes.
you're going into a a given situation, in your case, of a community of 6,000 people who um, are embedded in this touristic activity, um, and the pressures, the rising pressures of it all. How What's the pathway that you see in building that inside of what you just described, as a necessary precondition for the kids to learn inside of that community?
Well, there's a really interesting thing that relates to the brokenness of work and family.
Mm-hmm.
This becomes a question of home economics
Mm-hmm.
because the big challenge is, and we see this with our daughter's best friend and her parents, we're really good friends with them. And they're both artists. And so the wife makes a lot of handmade cosmetics and soaps and things like this. And the husband is a weaver and makes clothing and jewelry. and they sell it in their store.
Mm-hmm.
And so by many measures, like these are wonderful people
Mm-hmm.
doing a lot of the right things.
Mm-hmm.
But because their livelihood depends on paying rent,
Mm-hmm.
which requires them to sell things in their store,
Mm-hmm.
their house, as is it's structured in this town, the front of their house that's facing the street is a store, and their
Mm-hmm.
house is in the back. So their
Mm-hmm.
child is growing up in a store.
Mm-hmm.
So their home environment is to be in a commercial space
Mm-hmm.
where customers are coming and going all the time.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you see, it's a question of home economics.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a topic that doesn't come up nearly enough. I actually took classes in home economics because I grew up in a rural environment where, in seventh and eighth grade, we learned how to mend our clothes with a needle and thread and how to
Mm-hmm.
do
Mm-hmm.
baking and cooking. And
Mm-hmm.
these of course, were classes in the 1950s to teach women to be housewives, is the history of it. But
Mm-hmm.
by the time I was taking them in the late 80s and early 90s, everyone took them and it was a great education. But now we look at this and ask ourselves, what is the home economics? What is the economic model of the family? And this is a question we ask because currently there are three categories of education available to parents. There's regular schools,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that means in your local place. There's
Mm-hmm.
alternative schools, whatever's available, Waldorf and Montessori and things like this. And then there's homeschooling.
Mm-hmm.
These are the three standard categories. And what we found is that we need a blend of all three.
Mm-hmm.
And the blend is that we want to do homeschooling together with other families, but we want the homeschooling with the other families to be interwoven with the home economics of those
Okay.
families.
Okay.
So, as much as possible, those families are living regeneratively. So, the children are learning regenerative living with the
Mm-hmm.
adults. And
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of a blend of all three, but we don't quite have it. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's a
Mm-hmm.
bridge. We'll have a suboptimal version of it because we
Mm-hmm.
haven't liberated everyone from the old economy.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so what I'm hearing is that it's a gradual process of also creating islands of this type of learning environment inside of the community, and then trusting that this will become the desirable model so that it spreads inside of the community. Um, Maybe the desirability comes from the economic liberation has that by definition has to go with it, and the perceived intuitive understanding that um, it is your life is nicer if you spend it with your kids and your family.
There's this part, and then there's also the higher level part,
Mm-hmm.
which is the landscape scale part of this.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to do with the need to create commons. So, shared community spaces that are
Mm-hmm.
dynamically set up as commons
Mm-hmm.
that are connected physically to land.
Mm-hmm.
Because the source of impoverishment and the source of economic slavery is land displacement.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you don't own land and you have to
Mm-hmm.
rent,
Mm-hmm.
then you have a power dynamic with someone who who controls your livelihood through your ability to pay rent or not. And then
Mm-hmm.
you must make money. And so, one of the ways we're addressing this is with the foundation that we're setting up in the Bharatichar Regeneration Fund, is
Mm-hmm.
to strategically raise money to buy some land, to buy pieces of land in the landscape to set up as community commons, which is also connected to economic liberation.
Uh, just one sec. I'll
Yeah.
join you later. I'm still in a call.
And also, in parallel with this, to create a mindset of what David Bollier calls commoning, which
Mm-hmm.
is to behave as though things are commons. And the way we do this is we work with people who are private landowners to
Mm-hmm.
treat
Mm-hmm.
their land as though it's part of a commons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For example, there might be several neighbors who all live in the same drainage basin, and they all have concerns about water because water scarcity is a big problem here. And if they start organizing to reforest their drainage basin, then they're treating their private land as part of a larger commons conception,
mhm, mhm,
and they're enacting it culturally. So the idea is to create commons on land, either by buying land to put into a nonprofit ownership arrangement or a
mhm,
cooperative ownership arrangement
mhm,
so that it is legally a commons,
mhm,
or to work with private landowners to create a cultural pattern of commoning so that the
mhm,
land
mhm,
becomes a commons, even though there's a private land ownership framework that still
mhm,
exists.
mhm,
And by doing this, what it creates is it creates economic liberation from land tenure, from rent seeking, to go back to the old phrase used by Adam Smith. Um, Rent seeking is one of the fundamental disconnects for this kind of a system. It goes against it. So, for example, our friends who need to cater to the tourists,
mhm,
partly it's because they don't own a house and they're trying to raise enough money to be able to buy land
mhm,
so they could live more freely.
mhm,
But if through our reforestation efforts, we're able to bring in money that converts some private land into community land, then
mhm,
some families can live on that land
mhm,
while
mhm,
living a regenerative lifestyle connected
mhm,
to this alternative economy.
mhm,
And
mhm,
again, it's just bridge building. And so I think this key piece of connecting the home economics to landscape, to ownership models, to commons-based management models, these other elements are essential. And it's because there are nested scales of organization that naturally occur. And we need to design at all of the levels simultaneously.
mhm,
More emphasis for one than another at any moment, but there need to be a small set of people within the community that play this shamanic role across levels within the
mhm,
community.
mhm,
And
mhm,
I see this a lot where people say, Joe, you're being so ambitious trying to raise money for the territorial scale. Why
mhm,
don't you just
mhm,
focus on one project? And it's
mhm,
because I have observed, I've traveled to a lot of permaculture projects, and there's so much focus in keeping a great project going that they don't have the capacity to look out to the scale of working across projects, and nor should they.
mhm,
But there needs to be a functional capacity in the community for that. Someone needs to do it.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
And it needs to be someone other than those individual projects.
Yeah. So some portion of the population that acts as a pollinator or glue or both between the separate projects.
Yeah, they're playing
Um,
coordinating,
mm,
communicating, convening, shared visioning, facilitation roles.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm, mhm. Are you familiar with the ideas of Alexander Bard?
I am a little.
Mm.
I've come across his work a few times, but not in depth. So
Yeah.
I've read a
Uh,
couple of things, but nothing extensive.
uh, it comes up again and again, and that's why I'm referring to it because that glue element or cross pollination element is a part of his observation of how hunter-gatherer tribes were formed. That there, he looks at it through the lens of gender or sex,
Yeah.
um, and but but if you remove that from the equation and just boil it down to the actual roles, then one of the elements is this internal cohesion group of 4% of the population that's connect people. I would really be curious about the whether the numbers he proposes, which is 4% shamanic, 4% cross pollinators, and the rest equally shared between the internal nurturing and the external outgoing venturing parts, holds true in newer designs of communities. Um,
Yeah, my intuition from having studied complex systems is that it's probably a universal organizing pattern and
mhm,
that it would hold. So
mhm,
my hypothesis or any hypotheses I formed would be to assert that there is a theoretical motivation to say that this is likely to be correct and then look for confirmation or look for
mhm,
disconfirmation,
mhm,
basically gather evidence
And
around the hypothesis.
you're building your intuition in this case on the fact that if his observation is true, hunter-gatherer tribes evolved this over many years, and so there must be uh, some systemic rule to that. Is that
Yeah,
correct or
or maybe
yeah?
even that it's even broader than hunter-gatherer societies,
Mm,
um, and that it's connected to the information complexity of nested living systems for any living
mm-hmm,
system, and
mm-hmm,
that there are particular expressions of it in the architecture and the dynamics of human cultures. But
mm-hmm,
if you looked at ant colonies, or if you looked at a forest ecosystem, it's similar to Jeffrey West's universal allometric scaling laws in biology, that because it really has to do with architecture and circulation and the thermodynamics of nutrient flow. So it's universal for living systems. That there may be a similar principle that applies here that has to do with information ecology. And if so, it
mm-hmm,
wouldn't be limited only to hunter gatherer societies, but the mechanisms would be limited to hunter gatherer societies. For
mm-hmm,
example, the use of symbolic language in shared language groups
mm-hmm,
would be distinct to humans because non humans don't have that.
mm-hmm,
But, so that's a mechanism. But the need for a functional pattern might be chemotaxis for
mm-hmm,
ants. And that serves the same function, but the information dynamic. So I'm thinking it may be something of that nature that would suggest that this would as a heuristic, it should hold, is what I would think.
which leads to, and you just used the word, to symbols.
Yeah.
We can only start using all of these patterns and things and ideas and roles, and if we have symbols for them that we can use as words in our communication to point to things, right? um, and uh, I am interpreting the Game B, IDW, metamodernists conversations as a global effort in trying to evolve the set of symbols that's that we need to have this language to express what we're actually doing or what we intend to do. Um, are there some symbols in that sense that stick out to you that you would like to describe?
Well, some of the symbols that I think are really important, and you can see them in petroglyphs of indigenous cultures, like the spiral, just to give one example. Um, that these are going to be really important. And a person who's done very interesting work on this is Tom Atlee
Mm-hmm,
at the Collective Intelligence Institute in Eugene, Oregon. And he's very much an abstract thinker and not very much of a doer. He's just a philosopher. But what I like about his work is he has created visual representations of patterns for every
mm-hmm.
social dynamic he could find. And then he created a set of playing cards.
Wow,
So you have,
that's great.
they're like, I think like tarot cards or something. They're
Mm-hmm,
cards
mm-hmm,
that have visual representation, pattern languages. And when I looked at them, I found them not to be very useful for my work,
mm-hmm,
only because I already think with them, so I don't need an
mm-hmm,
artifact. But I have a friend who does tarot readings, and really, he's just a very good intuitive psychologist and is a good
mm-hmm.
friend. So he knows
Yeah.
his friends, he knows how to give them advice, and he knows how to ask the right questions.
Mm-hmm,
And so he uses tarot readings to read the symbols to help people ask good questions, which is more like being a good therapist than being a good
yeah,
tarot reader.
I agree.
But
Mm-hmm,
but this way of being, I think, is really valuable. And in that case, the tarot cards are really useful. And so what I think is important here is to have pattern languages
mm-hmm,
and then to have tools, artifacts that we can use to articulate and to teach those languages in pedagogically appropriate ways,
mm-hmm,
for diverse learning environments, for little kids
mm-hmm,
different from adults, et cetera, et cetera.
mm-hmm,
Um, and in that sense, what I see as really powerful is things like teaching interdependence,
mm-hmm,
or teaching something like dynamic disharmony, which is
Okay.
basically dynamic equilibrium, which is different from static equilibrium. Um, if your heartbeat goes to resting dynamic, that means you're dead. You know, the idea of a chaotic attractor, there's always some disharmony, which is why it's never perfectly periodic. And the disharmony is what creates dynamic balance. Dynamic equilibrium arises through what John Fullerton phrased this as seeking harmony or
Mm-hmm.
seeking balance, not
Okay.
achieving balance, but
But
seeking it.
seeking it, yeah.
And so
Yeah.
this is a
Yeah.
pattern language to say, what does it mean to seek balance? It means you never reach it. Your goal isn't to
Mm-hmm.
reach it. But if you seek it, you actually dynamically find it, which is the
Mm-hmm.
paradox. And
This
holding
this
paradox is another example of a pattern language thing. There are going
mhm.
to be a set of these that are going to be really important.
That reminds me of something I recently heard from Gerhard Hüther, who's a neuroscientist from Germany, and he distinguishes between um, s- striving towards a state of coherence versus striving towards a feeling or a sense of coherence. The state of coherence is inherently unachievable. I mean, just thermodynamics tells you that, um, and and but the sense of coherence is achievable, and he he interprets the sense of coherence as a congruence of three things. One is the capacity for sense making, the felt agency in the world, and the connectedness to a purpose higher than yourself. And if you balance these three things, you go into a a stronger sense of coherence. And I would add to that that there's a you can use the spiral for that, but there's a growth pattern to that as well. As you rise in mindset complexity, the shape of these three elements changes. Right? Your agency in the world changes, your sense making changes, everything changes, but your sense of coherence can stay strong throughout that journey. Um, that's how I would see it. But it's hard to explain those things. I'm practicing on my son, but you're right. So pattern language is very good.
And one way of teaching pattern language is through immersive interaction with the intelligence of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And just to give an example, our daughter really likes to collect the caterpillars that she finds in the community reforestation project. And then she plays with them for a little while and then she puts them back on a tree where they like to eat. You know, she knows which leaves they like to eat. And what's important is the exploratory play is
Mm-hmm.
interacting with another intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
This caterpillar thinks, feels, and acts in the world differently than she does.
Mm-hmm.
And she needs to learn how to partner with this intelligence to be
Mm-hmm.
able to interact with it appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
So she's practicing by us allowing her to play with these insects and by us guiding and saying, oh, don't put it there, be nice to it, it's a living person, and blah blah blah, these
Mm-hmm.
little things we can do as adults, as parents,
Mm-hmm.
invites her to explore in an open-ended fashion
Mm-hmm.
what the patterns are. And because human intelligence is quite profound, she's able to discern patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Now, her 2-year-old ability was less than her 3-year-old ability. She's
Mm-hmm.
about to
Mm-hmm.
turn 4.
Correct.
And of
Yeah.
course, we had to oversee and protect the insects more earlier. And now
Mm-hmm.
she's the one who's protecting them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's developmental appropriateness for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think this ability to have immersion and interaction with other intelligences, and including non-living intelligences, like we've been building water retention systems, which
Mm-hmm.
means when it rains, we take a pickaxe, we go out into the rain, and we
Mm-hmm.
watch where the water's moving, and then we dig canals to direct the water toward the trees.
Mm-hmm.
So we're
Mm-hmm.
interacting with the pattern language of water
Mm-hmm.
in the landscape. So it doesn't have to be a living intelligence. It just has to
Mm-hmm.
be a form of non-human intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
an intelligence of the other. And of course, there is the intelligence of the other human. Like as she's learning to speak English to some kids and Spanish to other kids, she's
Mhm.
learning human intelligence is different too.
Mhm.
But I think this, as the parent, we need to recognize that there's this realm of learning that has to do with interaction and emergence with other intelligences, which is a meta level pattern for us.
Mhm.
We're just noticing, oh, this is a different kind of intelligence. How do we help? How do we scaffold and support our child's learning for this intelligence?
Mhm. Mhm.
Which is more our role, which can be fairly abstract.
Mhm.
Whereas for our 4-year-old daughter, it's very concrete.
Mhm. And then mirroring that back into your life, um, you're connecting with other intelligences like the water flow, or maybe other human beings, or the collective. And and if you've learned that patterning, um, then as a child already, then you're more likely to be able to see them, and and interact with them and adapt to them, if necessary, or adapt them.
Yeah, and also during times when you're fairly lonely, you're on a
Mhm.
journey that takes you away from community.
Mhm.
The patterns can become comfort. They can be familiars. And this
Mhm.
happened to me for a period of time when I was studying more advanced mathematics and
Mhm.
philosophy. I found comfort in recognizing patterns. It's like, oh, here's
Mhm.
this familiar pattern. During times when I lost, because I was studying the patterns, I lost relatability. I couldn't relate to people in
Yeah.
my specific social context. But
Yeah.
the patterns, it was again that relational framing. The patterns
Yes.
became part of my mind interacting with the world. And while it would be unhealthy for me to stay there for too long, it would also be unhealthy for me to not stay there when it's part of my developmental path.
Mhm. Mhm.
I was growing into something where I found great joy in seeing those patterns, great meaning, great purpose, great comfort,
Mhm.
sometimes great distress. I would see a pattern and dislike it, but then I would
Mhm.
find empowerment in learning how to deal with the pattern. So the story of learning about climate change is an example. I saw a very distressing pattern. I saw it
Mhm.
everywhere I went, but I
Mhm.
gradually cultivated in myself a pathway of empowerment and meaning by learning to do something about the distressing pattern. And so this is also another level of development, another aspect of this that's I'm I'm sure you ponder in various ways with the kind of work you're doing.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, I have to take, which was a beautiful way, by the way, your last sentence as the end of our conversation today, because my time is running out. I have a couple of people waiting in another room in 2 minutes. Um, uh, but I hope that our conversation is far from over, even if the time is over for today. It was really, really amazing, and I learned so much from you. Thank you so much. And I'm I'm gonna digest this and listen to it again, and research and make some notes. And I would love to hop onto another one
Yeah, that would be
at one
beautiful.
point.
I would love that
Yeah.
as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Thank you.
you. And I'll let you go so you can seamlessly move to your next gathering.
Thank you. Okay.
But I look forward
And
to more.
thank you. And I wish you an amazing day with the family and everything else. And see you soon.
Thank you. And I look forward to more.